Hello and welcome to Renegade Files, your source for paranormal events, unsolved mysteries, and covert culture. I'm your host Lex Gordon, broadcasting from the Jungle Villa Outpost, deep in the uncharted tropics. This is Renegade Files episode 118, The Stanford Prison Experiment, How Power Turns Ordinary People into Monsters. In a locked basement, beneath a quiet university campus, the line between who someone was and how they behaved began to blur. It didn't take trauma. It didn't take years. It took days. Uniforms were assigned. Roles were given. Names were stripped away and replaced by numbers. And almost immediately, something shifted. Not just in behavior, but in identity. Because the real question isn't what happened in that basement, but what happens when ordinary people are given power over others. In 1971, at Stanford University, a psychological study known as the Stanford Prison Experiment set out to explore that exact question. What it turned into was one of the most famous and disturbing experiments in modern psychology. Tonight, we peer into that basement. This episode will explore three things: the experiment itself and the behaviors it unleashed, the controversy that followed and the questions it raised, and what we have learned from it all. Because if identity can be rewritten so quickly, then who we are might not be as fixed as we think. Join me now, and together we will explore the Stanford Prison Experiment, how power turns ordinary people into monsters. Part 1. The Experiment. In the summer of 1971, a research team at Stanford University set out to explore a question that had lingered in psychology for decades. What influence do roles and environments have on human behavior, especially in situations involving power and authority? At the center of the study was Professor Philip Zimbardo, who, along with his colleagues, designed a project intended to simulate life inside a prison. The volunteers weren't criminals, they were college students, recruited through a newspaper advertisement offering payment for a study on the psychology of imprisonment. From a pool of applicants, researchers carefully selected individuals who appeared psychologically stable, physically healthy, and free from any history of serious behavioral issues. Extensive screening interviews and personality assessments were conducted to ensure that those chosen represented what could reasonably be described as emotionally normal young men. Once selected, the subjects were randomly assigned roles. Some would become prison guards, and others would become prisoners. These assignments were entirely arbitrary. There was no correlation between personality traits and these assigned roles. This randomization was essential to the premise of the experiment, as it allowed researchers to observe whether actions would emerge from the role itself rather than from the individual's prior disposition. The physical setting was constructed in the basement of Stanford's psychology building. Hallways were converted into prison wings. Doors were replaced with barred enclosures. A small, dark space was designated for solitary confinement. Surveillance equipment was installed so that researchers could observe interactions without being constantly there. The setting was designed to feel controlled, enclosed, and authoritative, even though it existed within an academic institution. From the beginning, the structure of power was clearly defined. The guards were given responsibility for maintaining order. They worked in shifts and were told they could use whatever non-physical methods they deemed necessary to manage the prisoners. There were no detailed scripts or strict instructions, only a general directive to enforce rules and preserve control. Rules were things like you're only allowed to talk to each other during specified recreation times. You have to eat at a certain time, you have to go to sleep at a certain time, those types of behavioral rules. The prisoners, by contrast, entered this system through a process designed to remove personal identity. They were subjected to staged arrests at their homes or in their classrooms. They were transported by real policemen and processed in a manner consistent with actual law enforcement. Upon arrival at the simulated prison, they were stripped of their personal belongings, assigned ID numbers, and issued identical clothing consisting of loose smocks, rubber sandals, and stocking caps that concealed their hair. From that point on, they were referred to only by their assigned numbers and never their names. These conditions weren't physically harsh in the traditional sense, but they were psychologically potent. The removal of individuality, combined with the structure of authority imposed by the guards, created an environment in which identity started to shift. Those selected were placed inside of a system that defined who they were allowed to be. The first day passed with a sense of adjustment. There was a degree of uncertainty, some awkwardness, and moments where the artificial nature of the system was still apparent. Those who had volunteered were clearly aware that they were part of a study. But then, later in the day, some of the prisoners broke a few of the rules, talking outside of the designated recreation time, going to sleep early or staying up a little too late. So by the second day, this awareness of being part of a study started to fade, and the roles were quickly adapted to. Because of the early rule breaking, the guards responded swiftly and curtailed some of the freedoms, restricting the times of the recreation hours, making the lights out time earlier, and because of this, the prisoners immediately organized a resistance. They barricaded their cell doors using their beds, they refused to comply with certain instructions, and what began as a collective pushback quickly became a turning point in the study. The guards responded by asserting their command more forcefully. They removed privileges entirely, disrupted sleep, and introduced punishments designed to reestablish the hierarchy of control. From that moment on, the tone of the experiment changed. The guards started to develop their own methods of maintaining order. So some of the punishments that they were allowed to do, or that were set out in the early stages of the project, were, let's see, I have them right here. I thought I had them right here. Okay, here we go. Forced physical activities, so guards would make prisoners perform strenuous exercise as a form of punishment. Verbal abuse, guards frequently used derogatory language and insults to demean the prisoners. And the dreaded solitary confinement, so very disobedient prisoners were isolated from the group in solitary dark confinement, which heightened their distress. Okay, so the guards began to develop their own methods of maintaining order, so the aforementioned curtailing of privileges. Some adopted stricter enforcement styles, issuing their commands with increasing intensity. Others introduced arbitrary rules that had little functional purpose but reinforced the hierarchy. Over a very short time, patterns of conduct emerged that were not directed by the researchers but seemed to arise from the situation itself. One of the more interesting developments occurred when the guards began wearing mirrored sunglasses. This was not part of the original design or uniform. There was no instruction or requirement for them to do so, yet the choice carried significant psychological weight. The reflective lenses obscured the guards' eyes, removing a key element of human connection. Eye contact, which often serves as a form of empathy and recognition, communication, this was eliminated, and in its place was a surface that reflected the prisoner back at himself. This gets us into the whole archetype of the mask, the division of self from environment, all that. This effect was immediate and symbolic. The sunglasses functioned as a barrier, reinforcing the divide between those in control and those subjected to that control. The sunglasses created a sense of anonymity for the guards and a sense of detachment for the prisoners. The person behind the glasses became less accessible, less readable, and, in some ways, less accountable. As the days progressed, the ways people acted in both groups intensified. The guards became more aggressive and, in some cases, more assertive in their enforcement of rules. Punishment evolved from simple directives to more elaborate forms of control. Prisoners were required to perform repetitive tasks, endure verbal reprimands, and in some cases, participate in what was called humiliating exercises. I'm not exactly sure what. The prisoners, in turn, started to show clear signs of psychological strain. Some attempted to resist, challenging the authority of the guards and pushing back against the imposed structure. Others became withdrawn, displaying symptoms of stress, anxiety, and emotional fatigue. The surroundings created a feedback loop in which the behavior of one group reinforced the conduct of the other. Several participants experienced acute emotional distress. One prisoner exhibited signs of severe anxiety and was released early. Others showed signs of disorientation, confusion, and a diminishing sense of self. The loss of personal identity, reinforced by the use of numbers instead of names, contributed to a gradual erosion of their individuality. Punishments became more complex and at times more degrading. Prisoners were subjected to tasks that emphasized their lack of control. Privileges, such as food and bedding and talking, were used as tools of compliance. The structure of the terrain, as it were, allowed for these dynamics to develop without direct physical coercion. Control was maintained through psychological means, through power, through rules, expectations, and the normalization of responses within the system. What became increasingly clear was that the people involved were adapting to their roles in ways that extended beyond conscious decision-making. The guards weren't necessarily acting out of personal cruelty, and the prisoners weren't inherently submissive or even rebellious. Instead, their behaviors appeared to align with the expectations and pressures of the situation they inhabited. This led to one of the central interpretations. Psychologists often distinguish between dispositional and situational explanations for human behavior. A dispositional explanation attributes actions to internal characteristics such as personality, values, or moral beliefs. In other words, a person's disposition. A situational explanation focuses on external factors like environment, social roles, and context. The Stanford Prison Experiment provided a striking example of situational influence. Individuals who had been screened for psychological stability and a lack of aggressive tendencies started to exhibit traits that, under normal circumstances, would have been inconsistent with their personalities. The guards enforced authority with increasing severity. The prisoners internalized their roles to the point of literal emotional breakdown. This raised a broader and more unsettling possibility. If behavior can be shaped so rapidly by the system we occupy and our roles in it, then the boundary between what a person is and what a person does may be far more flexible than commonly assumed. The idea that ordinary individuals could engage in harmful, abusive conduct under certain conditions became one of the most widely discussed outcomes of the study. It suggested that the context in which a person operates can significantly influence their actions, sometimes overriding prior beliefs about right and wrong. At the time, the early interpretation of the simulation emphasized the power of environment in shaping morality, the structure of power, the removal of identity, and the normalization of control created conditions in which the things people were capable of doing changed. The study appeared to demonstrate that systems and roles can guide individuals toward actions they might not otherwise have taken or even considered. This interpretation would later become a point of debate, but within the context of the experiment itself, the pattern was difficult to ignore. The role players entered as individuals, and within days, they started to function as components of a system, and the system defined their behavior. What took place in that basement was not driven by physical force or explicit instruction. It came about from the interaction between role, surrounding, and human psychology. And in that interaction, the boundaries of identity proved more permeable than many had expected. And if you like these investigations and want to help keep this show going, join the Renegade Files Agency on Patreon and unlock exclusive agent-only bonus episodes, the Dark Intel Files, and secret dispatches. If you believe in digging deeper and keeping truth alive, then join me at patreon.com/renegadefiles. There's a link in the show notes. And become an agent today. It's free for a week. And thank you if you're already an RFA agent. You make this show possible. Part 2. Controversy and Ethical Collapse. As the events inside the simulated prison intensified, the study began to raise questions that extended far beyond its original purpose. What had been set up as an exploration of human activity under structured conditions was now revealing something more complicated. The environment was no longer a neutral setting for observation. It had become an active force, shaping the experience of every participant, including the researchers themselves. Concerns about ethics didn't emerge all at once. They developed gradually, often in response to specific moments that suggested the situation was moving beyond acceptable limits. At the time, formal oversight structures like modern institutional review boards weren't as fully developed or enforced as they are today. This meant that the responsibility for maintaining the ethical boundaries rested with the researchers conducting the study. Not the worst thing, but one less check and balance. Within that context, several warning signs became increasingly difficult to ignore. Study subjects started to show clear signs of psychological harm. Emotional distress wasn't limited to isolated incidents, but became a recurring feature of the whole scenario. Some prisoners experienced acute anxiety, disorientation, and feelings of helplessness. Like, some of them said they were going crazy because they had been there for years. Some of them said, "Can I write my parole officer? Can I call my mother? Can someone get me a lawyer?" They sort of started to become, or at least have moments of delusion. Others exhibited symptoms consistent with emotional breakdown, like uncontrollable crying, the confusion we mentioned before, and essentially withdrawal. These reactions weren't hypothetical, they were observable outcomes unfolding in real time. The issue of informed consent also became more complex as the study went on. because those involved had agreed to take part in a simulated prison, but the intensity and the nature of this experience went beyond what many might have reasonably anticipated. The line between simulation and experience started to blur, and as conditions escalated, the concern became whether or not participants could meaningfully come back from this setting where authority and control had become defining features of their daily interaction. The lack of external oversight meant that there were limited mechanisms to reassess the study once it was underway. Decisions about continuing or stopping the study remained fully internal. This made a situation where the same people responsible for designing the experiment were also those responsible for deciding whether or not they should keep doing it. At the center of this dynamic was Professor Philip Zimbardo, whose role extended beyond that of a traditional researcher. So here's another issue here. In addition to overseeing the study, he adopted the position of prison superintendent, so like the warden, within the simulation. This dual role introduced a conflict that would later become one of the most frequently cited criticisms of the entire project. As warden, he was part of the system he was observing. As a researcher, he was expected to maintain analytical distance, but doing both of these roles became difficult to reconcile, and in practice they started to overlap. But there's more to it than that. So this is evidence that the structure of rule within the study was not entirely self-generated by the actors in this strange play. Archival materials and later analyses have suggested that guards may have received guidance that encouraged certain forms of assertive behavior. In a 2018 analysis of previously unexamined recordings, the researchers Alex Haslam and Stephen Riker noted that, quote, the guards were encouraged to believe that it was their responsibility to create a sense of fear in the prisoners, end quote, and that this framing may have influenced how they understood their role. This doesn't imply that every action was directed or scripted, but it raises questions about how much of the observations emerged organically and how much may have been shaped by expectations communicated by those in charge of the study, that is. So the presence of the warden role or the superintendent role, being the professor who was guiding the study, had this reinforcing effect on the guards. Authority within this setting was fully embodied and by someone who was already an authority figure. When those involved perceived that the person in charge supported or tolerated certain actions, those actions became very quickly normalized. In this case, the structure of the experiment may have been unintentionally validated and the escalating control measures tolerated even when those measures contributed to participant distress. As conditions continued to intensify, the situation reached a point where, luckily, there came an intervention. Although maybe accidentally. So the turning point came with a student named Christina Maslock, a graduate student who visited the mock prison several days after it began. Upon observing the interactions between guards and prisoners, she expressed immediate concern about what she was seeing. Her reaction wasn't analytical or detached, it was personal and direct. In other words, she basically flipped out. She questioned how this could possibly continue given the evidence of psychological impact happening on real people. Professor Zimbardo later recounted that her response, that is, Christina Maslock's response, prompted a reevaluation of the experiment by him, and in his own words, he recognized that he had become too immersed in the role he was playing within the simulation. The perspective Christina Maslock provided came from outside of the system, which allowed her to see with fresh eyes what those inside it were accepting as normal. By that point, the cumulative effects of the environment were becoming difficult to justify. The students were exhibiting sustained distress. The behaviors being observed were no longer aligned with the original parameters of a controlled study. So the decision was made to terminate the project early, and this was after only 6 days. But the early termination didn't really resolve the actual problems with the study. I mean, it stopped it, yes, but it was more a case of, oh crap, let's cut our losses. Sorry guys, you can go home now, see you later. If this happened today, the lawsuits would be astounding. In the years that followed, the Stanford Prison Experiment became one of the most widely discussed studies in psychology. It was cited as evidence of the powerful influence of situational factors on conduct. At the same time, it became a focal point for criticism related to methodology, ethics, and studies interpretations. One area of critique focused on the study's design. The sample size was small, and all those chosen were drawn from a relatively narrow demographic group. They were all men, they were all about the same age, they all attended the same exact university. This limited the extent to which findings could be generalized. Critics also pointed to the absence of a control group and the lack of standardized procedures. Both of these are important for establishing scientific reliability. Another line of criticism addressed the possibility of influence by expectations. Expectations about how the students doing this might have thought they were supposed to behave. The concept of demand characteristics suggests that individuals in such a situation might adjust their actions based on cues about what the researchers are studying. In the context of a simulated prison, the students might have drawn on cultural representations of guards and prisoners, so things like movies or books, to inform their behavior. This perspective was articulated by social scientist Thibaut Letexier, who conducted an extensive archival review of the entire debacle. He argued that, quote, the guards did not spontaneously become sadistic, end quote, and that many of their actions reflected an understanding of what was expected of them within the parameters of the study. His analysis suggests that the actions observed may have been shaped by the narrative of the project as much as the setting of the project. Other researchers have raised similar concerns. A 2018 article published in the journal American Psychologist by the previously mentioned Haslam and Riker explains that, quote, the evidence for the natural emergence of tyranny in the Stanford Prison Experiment is weak, end quote, and that the students appeared to actively construct their roles rather than simply internalize or evolve into them. These critiques don't deny that meaningful changes occurred within the experiment. Instead, they challenge the interpretation of those shifts as a direct reflection of human nature under pressure. They suggest that context includes not just physical surrounding, but also expectations, also instructions, and cultural understanding of roles. Attempts to replicate the findings of the Stanford Prison Experiment have produced mixed results. Some studies have observed increased conformity to roles, while others have failed to reproduce the same level of behavioral escalation. This inconsistency has contributed to a broader reassessment of the study's initial conclusions. Modern perspectives tend to approach this study with greater caution. It's still recognized as an influential moment in the history of psychology, but it's also viewed as a case that illustrates the importance of ethical safeguards and methodological rigor. The central question remains, to what extent did this reveal something fundamental about human predisposition? And to what extent did it reflect the specific conditions under which it was conducted? It's obvious that the study blurred the boundary between observation and participation. The roles didn't merely describe the parts people would play, but they also influenced how those people playing the parts understood themselves and others in the context of the experiment. The controversy surrounding the Stanford Prison Experiment is not limited to what happened inside the simulated prison. It extends to how those events were interpreted, communicated, and remembered. Over time, the narrative has become as significant as the experiment itself. In examining that narrative, it becomes necessary to consider not only what the people did, but why they did it, and how those actions were framed within the broader context of psychological research. The Stanford Prison Experiment remains a subject of ongoing discussion because it sits at the intersection of scientific inquiry and ethical responsibility. It offers insights into the power of terrain and role, while also demonstrating the risks of allowing those forces to go unchecked. As the focus shifts from what occurred to what it means, the story continues to evolve. If you want to evolve your style, be sure to check out the Renegade Files shop through the merch link in the show notes or at the website. T-shirts, hats, pint glasses, coffee cups, all priced to make getting some gear fun, so check out the shop and represent. Cheers. Part 3. What we learned and where we go from here. In the years following the Stanford Prison Experiment, its influence spread far beyond the walls of academia. The study became a reference point in discussions about human behavior, authority, and the power of environment. It was taught in classrooms, cited in textbooks, and discussed in both scientific and public forums. At the same time, it became a subject of ongoing debate, with interpretations evolving as new perspectives and analyses emerged. One of the most immediate effects was the study's contribution to the rise of situational psychology. Situational psychology emphasizes the role of external factors in shaping actions, often in contrast to explanations that focus primarily on internal traits. The study appeared to demonstrate that context could exert a powerful influence on actions, even among individuals who had been screened for psychological stability. This idea resonated with existing research, including the work of Stanley Milgram on obedience to power, and it helped reinforce a broader shift in how psychologists understand human conduct. The SPE, as it came to be known, also played a role in reshaping ethical standards within research involving human subjects. Although concerns about ethics had been present before, the visibility of this study brought renewed attention to the need for clear guidelines and oversight. Over time, this contributed to the development and strengthening of institutional review boards, commonly called IRBs. These bodies are responsible for reviewing research proposals to ensure that the test subjects are protected from unnecessary harm and that informed consent is meaningfully obtained. Modern research environments place significant emphasis on participant welfare, transparency, and accountability. Studies are required to outline potential risks, provide mechanisms for withdrawal, and include procedures for monitoring the well-being of the participants. While these standards emerge from multiple sources, this odd simulation is often cited as one of the cases that highlighted the importance and the need of such formal oversight. Beyond its impact on psychology as a discipline, this study has been used to explore real-world systems where lordship and hierarchy are central. Discussions about prison conditions frequently reference this project as a way of examining how institutional structures can influence behavior. The dynamics observed in the study, including the effects of dehumanization and the normalization of control have been compared to documented issues with correctional facilities. Similar parallels have been drawn with military situations where strict hierarchies and defined roles are integral to organizational function. In such settings, individuals operate within systems that emphasize obedience, discipline, and adherence to authority. While these structures serve practical purposes, they also raise questions about how individuals navigate moral responsibility within a chain of command. The experiment has also been considered with other studies of power, particularly those conducted by Milgram. Both lines of research explore how individuals respond to situations in which commanding figures provide direction or establish expectations. Together, they have contributed to a broader understanding of how context, structure, and perceived legitimacy can shape decision-making. Despite its influence, the interpretation of the Stanford Prison Experiment has not remained fixed. Philip Zimbardo originally presented the findings as evidence that situational forces could lead ordinary individuals to engage in harmful activities. His analysis emphasized the power of roles and conditions in shaping actions, suggesting that under certain conditions, behavior could shift, and sometimes to degrees that might not align with a person's prior beliefs or values. Many people would agree with this assessment. There are reasons that maybe extend beyond what he attributed them to. However, his ultimate conclusion seems to be theoretically sound. Over time, though, this interpretation has been challenged by researchers who argue that the narrative surrounding the case might have shaped the behavior and caused him to overstate his conclusions. Critics have pointed to methodological limitations, including the absence of standardized procedures, the potential influence of the researcher expectation, the fact that he played a role as a leader in the simulation when he was also the leader of the entire project. Some people have suggested that the changes observed were not just the result of situational pressure, but that they reflected what was expected within the context of the study. Modern researchers have taken a more nuanced approach, recognizing that people not only interpret and respond to their conditions, but they bring with them their own values, beliefs, understanding of cultural roles, and a defined decision-making process. The persistence of the Stanford Prison Experiment in public consciousness is partly due to its cultural impact. The study has been depicted in films, documentaries, and books, often presented as a dramatic illustration of how quickly roles can change under certain conditions, which they can. These portrayals have contributed to a broader awareness, but they've also influenced how this study is understood by the general public. So, how much of what people do is shaped by the systems they operate within? To what extent do roles and expectations influence our decision-making? And where does individual responsibility fit within these boundaries? These questions may have no straightforward answers. The tension between these viewpoints is part of what gives this experiment its lasting relevance. In considering where to go from here, it's important to recognize the lessons that have emerged both from the study itself and the discussions that have followed. Ethical safeguards in research are now more robust, with clear expectations regarding participant treatment and oversight. The pursuit of knowledge must be balanced with a commitment to protecting those who contribute to the process. In leadership, institutional design, and organizational culture, this moment in psychology history serves as a reminder that structures and expectations can drastically influence people. Creating environments that promote accountability, respect, and ethical decision-making is an ongoing challenge, but it's one that has been informed in part by the prison experiment. In the end, the central question remains open. Did the Stanford Prison Experiment reveal an inherent tendency within individuals to conform to roles and authority, or did it reflect the specific conditions and expectations of a particular study? The answer may lie somewhere in between. This chapter of psychological tinkering continues to prompt reflection on the relationship between landscape, leadership, and personal responsibility. It challenges assumptions about identity and behavior, and it also highlights the importance of ethical boundaries in the pursuit of understanding. It's part of a larger conversation about how people respond to the systems they occupy and how those systems are shaped by human choices. Whether it stands as a warning, a lesson, or a case of misinterpretation depends on how the story is told and how its findings are understood. The questions it raises have not been resolved, and that might be part of why it continues to endure. Tap follow on whatever app you're listening to so we can connect next time, and this also helps the show grow, and it helps new listeners find us, so thank you. Follow Renegade Files now. It's free and easy, and it means a lot. My summary. The story of the Stanford Prison Experiment leaves behind a set of conclusions that are hard to hold at once but impossible to separate. Within a matter of days, ordinary people began to change in ways that were measurable and deeply unsettling. Roles took hold, authority expanded, and identities narrowed. What started as a controlled simulation evolved into a situation where behavior reflected the structure of the environment more than the intentions of the volunteers. Over the decades, the legacy of the experiment has become increasingly complex. It has been used as evidence for the power of situation, but also challenged as a study influenced by expectation. The questions the Stanford Prison Experiment raises have not all been settled. They continue to follow any discussion of control, setting, and responsibility. If the situation changes, how certain are you of what you're capable of? That uncertainty in all of us is why this experiment is still discussed 55 years later, and will likely be 55 years from now. Thank you sincerely for investigating the Stanford Prison Experiment with me. Subscribe or follow the show now so together we can meet here next time and get into the deepest stories of UFOs, aliens, hauntings, cryptids, conspiracy theories, weird culture, and unsolved mysteries. I am so glad to have you in the Renegade Files crew. You have listened to the end. You love the paranormal and strange things in our world. Now, jump into the Renegade Files shop for hats, t-shirts, pint glasses, coffee mugs, and more, all with freaky cool designs. Come check out everything I've made for you there and represent the weirdness of Renegade Files on the street. Links to the shop are in the show notes and at therenegadefiles.com, so come on down and thank you. Until our next adventure, I'm your host, Lex Gordon. Stay wild, skater child. Stay wild.